Zionism became a unifying force for the Jews of Palestine and a much more powerful force. So we saw how in 1929, the very forces that the Mufti and other Arab leaders were trying to weaken or destroy were actually strengthened by this violence. And in the same vein, we see how after October 7th, the left wing in Israel, which paid the heaviest price on October 7th in southern Israel, so many of those who were kidnapped and killed were peace activists or left-wing Israelis who had spent the previous 9 months protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing government. Even they now say, what hope is there for peace when they really have shown their true colors in simply wanting to destroy us and have openly made that clear since October 7th, with Hamas leaders saying they intend to carry out October 7th over and over again until Israel is gone.
Hello and welcome to State of the Nation. I'm Eylon Levy. When Hamas launched the October 7th war, analysts immediately mentioned similarities with 1973. Another war that started with a shock invasion, another war that started after Israel ignored vital advance warning signs and left itself vulnerable to invasion. But maybe the better date is 1929, the date of another barbaric massacre perpetrated by Palestinian Arabs against Jews in the land of Israel. That massacre was the Hebron Massacre. My guest today has just published a book about the 1929 massacre and the shocking similarities with October 7th. Yardena Schwartz is an award-winning journalist and author of the newly published Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a deep dive into the history of the Mandate era, focusing on one particular turning point that defined the conflict still raging today. Together we discuss how history repeated itself and October 7th was an aftershock of the 1929 massacre. We talk about the religious underpinnings of the barbaric Palestinian violence we saw in 1929 and on October 7th. And we talk about how the media, and maybe more importantly, international policymakers, fail to learn the lessons of history in a way that condemns us to further and further rounds of conflict in a forever war being waged against Israel with seemingly no end in sight. Let's dive between the lines and beyond the headlines.
Breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage taking.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman.
Eylon.
What happens when the 4-day pause?
How do you resolve this?
Where does this go?
Yardena Schwartz, welcome to State of the Nation.
Thank you so much for having me, Eylon.
It's only fitting that we are filming this episode about a history book because this episode is a little piece of history for us. It's the first time that we are recording remotely instead of in the studio. Where in the world am I finding you?
I'm in New Jersey, my home state.
As part of your national book tour for your book, Ghosts of a Holy War, correct?
That's right. I've been taking this baby around the country, just came from Miami, heading to Cleveland tomorrow. So hope my brain isn't fried today.
Now, you started writing this book, Ghosts of a Holy War, before the October 7th massacre. But the similarities are, as you describe them, haunting and inescapable. I want in this episode for us to break down some of these similarities and differences between the 1929 Hebron Massacre and the October 7th massacre. But first I want to ask you, what was it like to see history repeating itself in front of your eyes as you were writing about it?
It was absolutely shocking. And I felt, like many people, as if I was living in a nightmare because it really felt as if the pages of history I had spent the previous 4 years reading and documenting and piecing together for this book had come alive. And, people say history repeats itself, but really on that day, it was the starkest example of that because the atrocities that were committed on August 24th, 1929 in Hebron were repeated on a massive scale on October 7th.
Now, you started writing the book before October 7th, but the manuscript wasn't submitted till after. How did your conception of the book change and evolve when suddenly it found new, contemporary, immediate resonance?
It really changed the book completely. It had to, because before October 7th, I was writing this book about a massacre, 1 century in Palestine, that ignited this conflict and its aftershocks, which continue to reverberate. And I was writing predominantly about the city of Hebron itself and how it had gone from being this beacon of coexistence in 1929 to the antithesis of peaceful coexistence that it is today, and what that tells us about the conflict and its driving forces. Yet, in the aftermath of October 7th, I realized that the causes and the aftermath of this century-old massacre, those lessons had not been learned. And this is why we're in this tragic nightmare we're still living through. And I realized that the duty I had in writing my book was to make those lessons very clear to anyone who hopes to resolve this conflict. And that's my hope in this book, that anyone who reads it will come away with a much better understanding of how we got here and what needs to change if we're ever to find a way out.
And in the course of our conversation, I do want to talk to you about those lessons. But first, for those who are less familiar with the history, take us back to the beginning. What happened during the 1929 Hebron Massacre?
So the Hebron Massacre was just one part of week-long riots that gripped the British Mandate of Palestine in late August 1929. That week, 133 Jews, men, women, children, young and old, were slaughtered, and more than 400 more were wounded over the course of a week of riots across Palestine. Every Jewish community was affected. The Jewish communities of Gaza and elsewhere were evacuated by the British authorities. But in Hebron, that beacon of coexistence where Jews and Muslims had lived side by side for generations, that place of all places was the scene of the worst horrors. More Jews were killed in more cruel ways than anywhere else. 67 Jews were slaughtered that morning of August 24th, 1929, by their Muslim neighbors. That included men, women, children, babies, and like we saw on October 7th, women and teenage girls were raped in front of their families before they were killed. Babies were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Men were castrated. People were burnt alive. And one of the most shocking elements of the massacre was the fact that so many of the assailants were friends, neighbors, landlords, business partners, co-workers of the people who they killed. And the Jewish community of Hebron, they had been warned that riots were going to break out. There had been a contingent of Haganah fighters who came to Hebron 2 days before the riots erupted and warned Jewish leaders in Hebron what was going to happen. They offered to send reinforcements and ammunition, or to evacuate the Jews of Hebron to Jerusalem until the riot passed over. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition. They said, we're not going anywhere. Our Arab friends and our neighbors will never hurt us. There had been riots on a much smaller scale, but there had been riots in Jerusalem in 1920 and Tel Aviv in 1921. And though those riots had reached other communities in Palestine, they never reached Hebron. And so the Jewish leaders of Hebron were sure that nothing would happen to them. And the fact that Hebron became the epicenter of the most brutal massacre and one of the worst pogroms ever perpetrated against Jews outside of Europe, the fact that they paid the heaviest price really transformed Zionism and the conflict itself. Because like the Jews who were murdered in southern Israel on October 7th, the Jews in Hebron were peaceful people. Just like the Jews in southern Israel were not settlers or, right-wing extremists. They were, peace-loving, left-wing, many of them peace activists. So it was in 1929 that the Jews who were murdered, they were not Zionists. Many of them were anti-Zionists, of a different flavor than we know today. But anti-Zionists, they believed that the Jewish return to Zion could only happen through God's will, the arrival of the Messiah. Many of the Jews who were slaughtered in 1929 in Hebron were Sephardi Jews who spoke Arabic, whose families had been in Hebron for generations. They had also been very skeptical or hesitant about the very secular Zionist movement because it was very different from their way of life. And that opposition to Zionism that preceded the massacre essentially evaporated among the Jews of Palestine after the massacre of 1929, because that massacre epitomized the tragedy of the stateless, powerless Jew. The British essentially stood by and allowed it to happen, especially in Hebron. There was a British police chief in charge of a force of about 40 policemen. All but one of them were Arabs. And those policemen either took part in the massacre or stood by and allowed it to happen. And there's mountains of evidence to confirm that. You know, my book, it has about 40 pages of source notes. And so there's testimony, vast testimony, both by British officials and survivors of the massacre, that also the British police chief, in the beginning, he told Jews when the violence began to erupt in Hebron, he told the Jews to just stay in their homes and nothing will happen to them. He didn't bring reinforcements. By the time he tried to bring reinforcements, it was too late. And by the time those reinforcements came from Gaza and Jerusalem, 67 Jews had been slaughtered and dozens more had been wounded. But just like we saw glimmers of hope emerge on October 7th with Arab citizens of Israel saving their Jewish brothers and sisters from Hamas, on August 24th in 1929, at least 200 Jews were saved by their Muslim neighbors who risked their own lives to hide them in their homes or stood outside their homes and placed their own bodies in front of the mob. One of those men literally arrived on a white horse and was stabbed in the leg while trying to protect the Jews who were living in his home. He was their landlord. And that was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron, who was saved by his Arab landlord and along with 30 other people, including his own family. But his son, Eliezer Dan Slonim, who was another Jewish leader of Hebron, he was murdered along with his wife and their 5-year-old son. And the mob included men who he had considered his friends until that day.
Immediately after the October 7th massacre, a lot of people's minds raced back to 1973, to the Yom Kippur War as the best historical parallel, because it was a shock attack after we saw the enemy preparing right on our borders and assumed that it was simply for show. But I don't think we even need to unpack the similarities for people to immediately see the flashbacks between October 7th and between 1929. But you not only claim that there are similarities between October 7th and the Hebron Massacre, you claim that October 7th is in fact an aftershock in some way of the 1929 massacre. So help me, how do you make that connection chronologically? How did one follow causally from the other?
So as if the atrocities themselves weren't powerful enough to show us these echoes of 1929, October 7th, the causes of the massacre of 1929 and the aftermath are almost identical. So what led to the massacre of 1929 was a campaign of propaganda and disinformation initiated by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. That man is familiar to many who listen to your podcast, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who would later ally himself and his cause with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. Before that, he began the rumor that we still hear today that in his time, the Jews of Palestine, today they say Israel, but in his time, he began the rumor that the Jews of Palestine had a plot to conquer Al-Aqsa, destroy the mosque to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He began that rumor in 1928. And it was that rumor and everything that came along with it and the increased violence and attacks against Jews who were praying peacefully at the Western Wall that led to the riots of 1929. So he claimed that Jews who were praying at the Western Wall and demanding British protection to do so in peace in the face of increasing attacks by Muslims at the wall, he claimed and he convinced his people that they were actually plotting to turn the Western Wall into a synagogue and from there destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild their ancient temple. So As you know, Hamas perpetuates that lie today, as have other Palestinian leaders since the Grand Mufti. And it's no coincidence that Hamas named its attack on October 7th the Al-Aqsa Flood, because that lie is so powerful and so galvanizing, unfortunately. And, we saw even after October 7th how Hamas tried to use Al-Aqsa to convince Arab Israeli citizens and Palestinians in the West Bank to flood Al-Aqsa in order to open new fronts in the war. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But other parallels we see to the aftermath of 1929 today, not just after October 7th, but also after the pogrom in Amsterdam, this pattern of denial and victim blaming, that didn't start on October 7th. That started after the massacre of 1929. I have pages of testimony I can read here, not testimony actually, just statements made by the Arab leadership in Palestine at the time, simultaneously denying that atrocities were carrying out while also blaming those atrocities on the Jewish victims, not just in the way we see today, we're saying, that they deserved it, but literally saying that Jews, in fact, Hebron yeshiva students, they claimed were the ones who killed Jews in Hebron, and that they did so in order to raise funds from the Jewish diaspora. So these, long-held anti-Semitic tropes that we see fueling the conflict today, those were also at work in 1929. And the Grand Mufti even used words from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which he was either unaware was a forgery or willfully, disseminated the pages that were translated into Arabic before almost any other language. He used that conspiracy theory to further convince his people of this Jewish plot to not just conquer Al-Aqsa, but to conquer the world.
And that similarity really is striking the historical pattern of 1, atrocity denial, 2, projection, accusing Jews of doing what was done to them. We see that now with the malicious blood libel accusing Israel of genocide when in fact October 7th was an act of genocide, and also with those claims of a false flag attack. Online we see people claiming that the people on October 7th were killed by Israeli forces, not by Hamas. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why do you think that the Palestinian national movement finds itself in that same pattern of committing attacks against Israelis, against Jews, and then denying the same atrocities they were so proud of, projecting and deflecting?
The unfortunate reason is that it works. We see, tragically, how news organizations allow this to happen, not just turning a blind eye to it, but recycling those same claims and presenting narratives in that same way as they're presented by perpetrators of these attacks. So we haven't just seen that in the media's coverage of October 7th, and of course now with Amsterdam being painted as if, the Jews who were chased down and beaten and run over deserved it simply because they chanted, deplorable slogans. They did that, I'm not denying that they did, but what other people would have an attack like that blamed on them by the media. And I think that we can all agree that if the people who chased down and beat Jews senseless were white supremacists and not Arab immigrants, I think we would see a very different narrative in the media about it. But we also see that in the conversation surrounding the context of Israel's creation. So often when you read about or hear in places like NPR, CNN, about how, Arabs were displaced in 1948 with Israel's creation, there is no mention of why they were displaced. And that was a war declared by every Arab leader in 1947 and by the Palestinians, by the Arabs of Palestine in 1947, when the UN voted to create a two-state solution. Palestine could have been free in 1948, and Palestine could have been an independent country for the first time in its history. I mean, it has never been independent, and it could have been if the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders had accepted that two-state solution in 1947 instead of declaring war against the Jews of Palestine. And yet,
not just declaring war. I notice in your book the striking language that actually what happened in 1948, or rather in 1947 with the rejection of the UN partition plan, was that the Arab world declared jihad against the Jewish state. And you write that the religious dimension of this conflict cannot be ignored. And yet I wonder, does the world nevertheless do a good job of ignoring that religious dimension, and why? And I'm asking this with your journalist hat on now.
Yeah, as a journalist, I've seen firsthand how editors remove these things from stories. And I think it is because in the Western world, it is very difficult for people to wrap their heads around this idea that religion still plays such a prominent role in fueling violence, because in the Western world, those days are long gone. And I think that in the Western world, the idea of political conflict and conflict over land, that makes more sense. That's easier for people to understand. And I think that's why so much of the media has painted this conflict as if it's a conflict over land, when really, all of the players in this conflict are constantly saying in their own words that this is a conflict of religion. I mean, on October 7th, in the hundreds of hours of footage that Hamas fighters uploaded to social media, they were not shouting Free Palestine. They were not shouting end the occupation or end the siege. They were shouting Allahu Akbar. They were praising Islam, just as the rioters did in 1929. And, this was called Al-Aqsa Flood. And, there was I didn't read any stories, not a single one, unpacking why that operation had that name and why Al-Aqsa is the logo. Al-Aqsa with a gun in front of it is the Hamas logo for a reason. I mean, there is a willful ignorance and a really just failure of journalistic integrity, because the whole idea of journalism is to explain the truth and not just to give readers and news consumers a kind of he said, she said version of events, but to actually find the truth. And, there are some inconvenient truths, and I think journalists are very ready to unpack inconvenient truths when it comes to other conflicts or other, political stories and narratives. But when it comes to this conflict, there is this choice to paint this conflict in as simplistic terms as possible. And I think that's why we see so much of this insistence on painting this conflict as if there's one victim and one oppressor, when really, there's 1 century of Palestinian rejection of peace here. And it's so clear. I mean, there's no arguing with the fact that Arab leaders in Palestine, first and foremost, the Grand Mufti, rejected the first two-state solution in 1937, presented by the British. And then he and every other Arab leader did the same in 1947. And then Arafat did it again in 2000. Abbas did it again in 2008. And yet we never hear about this. When news organizations describe this effort for peace and the Palestinian desire for a state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, they never mention the fact that they have been offered that very thing so many times, and they have said no every time. And it didn't have to be this way. And I think that the media plays one of the biggest roles, one of the most dangerous roles in fueling, perpetuating this conflict and the disinformation that comes with it.
And the media have definitely been ignoring the religious dimension. And I think one of the lessons that you show in the book of both 1929 and October 7th is that we ignore the religious dimension and the commitment to jihad at our peril. But I want to move on to other lessons and things we may be ignoring at our peril. It was striking to read that in both cases, massacres happened after warnings that were ignored. The Jews of Hebron were warned. An attack is being prepared. It is being mobilized. And they thought that it wouldn't happen because it couldn't happen. And I wonder whether one of the lessons then is that we have underestimated our enemies, and that the problem is that we have failed to believe the worst about our enemies, even when the evidence was right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still happening today. I mean, we know because the Islamic regime in Iran is constantly broadcasting its desire to destroy Israel and is constantly threatening to do that and is actively working to do that with this seven-front war fueled by Iran. And yet so many just choose to look the other way and pretend this conflict is one that, can be ended with, the kind of tools that you can end other conflicts with. And yet we are just going to be destined to more endless cycles of violence and more massacres if we continue to pretend that our enemies don't really mean what they say. I was just going to say that in 1929, it wasn't just the Jewish leaders of Hebron that ignored warnings. It was also the British that for the entire year that the Mufti had waged that propaganda campaign, which didn't include just disinformation about this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa, but he actively worked to prevent Jews from praying at the Western Wall, which then further tensions and exacerbated, it strengthened more extremist voices on the Jewish side saying, we need to take over the Western Wall. If this, this was the only place that Jews could pray, the single holiest place where Jews could pray. Jews had no access to the Temple Mount in 1929. Even in Hebron, the burial place of Abraham, where the tomb of the patriarchs holds, the mothers and fathers of the Jewish people, Jews were forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs for 700 years under Muslim rule. And, the Western Wall was this tiny, cramped area where Jews could pray. And before 1928, they did so in relative peace. But because of the Mufti's campaign to distract his own people from allegations of corruption against him, allegations of nepotism, and very true allegations of misuse of funds. He used religious funds to build a hotel, to build his own home. So the British, throughout that year, they did nothing about this disinformation campaign. They barely did anything to protect the Jews who were being attacked at the Western Wall. And the immediate cause of the riots was actually this peaceful march to the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av, just 10 days before the riots erupted. This peaceful march to the Western Wall calling on the British to enable Jewish access and peaceful prayer at the Western Wall and to redeem the Western Wall so that Jews could once again pray in peace there. The Arab press and the Arab leadership then painted that peaceful march as the opposite of peaceful. Rumors spread throughout Palestine that Jews had raped Muslim women, had cursed the Prophet Muhammad, and none of that had happened. But the truth had become irrelevant, as we see today. The truth is no longer relevant. And this didn't begin with social media. This has been going on for a century. And those rumors precipitated the eruption of the riots. And so, it wasn't just this idea among Jewish leaders in Hebron that their Arab friends and neighbors would never hurt them, but it was also the absolute failure of the British to protect their Jewish subjects.
So many cautionary tales there, especially the way that lies and misinformation can fuel riots. I mean, I'm particularly struck by the lesson there that we cannot allow ourselves to be lulled into complacency and thinking that our enemies have been mollified or don't mean what they say simply because it's so uncomfortable to believe that that same hostility is still there. I personally find it now in the same context of discussions around a potential two-state solution. And I say that as long as the Palestinians are still chanting from the river to the sea, we need to take seriously that that is their ultimate goal and that hasn't changed. But we risk slipping ourselves slipping into this complacency about potential massacres. And one of the alarming similarities between October 7th and Hebron was the sadism of the attacks. And many of the atrocities from Hebron could have been lifted straight out of the pages of Be'eri and Nir Oz. I mean, you mentioned the acts of rape, infants slaughtered in front of their parents, castration, torture, mutilation, dismemberment, people being burned alive, the absolute joy in it. You quote the front page of the New York Times saying that the Muslim Arabs seem to take particular delight in destroying Jewish religious institutions. And so I wonder, a century on, how do you explain the persistence of that sadism, of that bloodlust, of that enjoyment of violence among the most extreme elements of the Palestinian nationalist movement in pursuit of jihad?
Yeah, so I think it's important that you said that last part, that this is not, something that is supported or perpetrated by the masses of the Palestinian people. And I think that the chants of "from the river to the sea" are mostly being uttered, or only being uttered, by supposed supporters of the Palestinian people in the West. You see more support for Hamas by white people in America and in Europe than you do from Palestinians. I mean, they are able to recognize that Hamas brought this upon them. And I think the reason why there is still so much radicalism and extremism and these sadist attacks, which didn't begin on October 7th. I mean, I think it was about 2 years ago or in 2021 that a couple of Palestinians in the West Bank used axes to slaughter Jews. There have been so many horrific attacks on Jewish babies in the West Bank, deliberate slaughtering of babies for the sole reason that they exist. And I think we see this, and I don't just think, I'm sure that we see this because in the Palestinian education system, including in the UNRWA education system, and in the Palestinian media, including in children's shows, the idea of killing Jews is presented as an honor, a way to bring glory to your people. And people who do so are portrayed as people to admire, people to aspire to as role models. I saw this firsthand when I did an investigation for Foreign Policy magazine a few years ago about this UNRWA Education for Peace, which is what they claim their education curriculum is. And UNRWA's massive budget of well over $1 billion, 60% of that goes to their education system, which is doing the opposite of teaching peace to Palestinians, whether they're in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, anywhere that they're attending these schools. The one I went to in East Jerusalem, I met girls in elementary school who showed me the pages of their textbook where a female terrorist whose attack killed children on a bus in the 1970s, this is who they're told they should aspire to. These are the heroes of the Palestinian cause in an UNRWA school. And when I asked them what they're learning about peace, they looked at me bewildered, like they had never heard the word. When I asked them if they had been taught about the two-state solution, they didn't know what I was talking about. I asked them what they are taught to aspire to for Palestine. Like, what is the future? Like, what should Palestine look like? And they said, that it's all of the land. So, I don't think that they would be saying that if that wasn't what they were taught. And so it isn't the fault of these Palestinian children that this is what UNRWA is teaching them. It's the fault of UNRWA and the United Nations and anyone who resists calls to reform this broken institution that is only fueling more violence, which ultimately, usually the Palestinian people are the ones who pay the heaviest price. I mean, this is not helping the Palestinian people to radicalize them and tell them to aspire to martyrdom.
Absolutely not, Yardena. And that's one of the ways that the international community has played a really destructive role in this conflict. Some perhaps out of a misguided belief that they're being nice and humanitarian by pouring money into refugee projects. Others know exactly what they're doing. And it's really shocking to think that most of the October 7th terrorists went to schools funded by Western taxpayers. And in that context, I'm thinking about the international response, both to the Hebron Massacre and to October 7th. Because in both cases, it seems to me, that response rewarded the violence, and in doing so encouraged more of it and trapped us in this cycle of violence rather than helping us escape from it. Because after 1929, the British response in the Shaw Commission, as you write in your book, was to blame the Jews for somehow provoking the violence against them. And one of the recommendations was restrictions on Jewish immigration. And that taught the Arabs that through barbaric violence, they could achieve political goals. In the same way that after October 7th, rather than sending the Palestinians a message that terrorism is a dead end, the countries lining up to recognize a non-existent Palestinian state are sending them the message that terrorism works and will take their national cause forward. And I wonder, again, with your journalism hat, why do you think in both cases the international community is getting this backwards and has this repeated pattern of rewarding violence in a way that condemns us to more of it?
Yeah, I've struggled with that question for the last year. I really cannot wrap my head around it because it is so clear from the facts of history that this does not work. And it only brings more death and destruction. Like I said before, often that death and destruction has more of a detrimental impact on the Palestinian people themselves. And I think the failure to see that is baffling. And in 1929, it wasn't just the restrictions on immigration and land purchases that followed the massacre, but also the pardoning of the Mufti. I mean, throughout hundreds of hours of testimony, it was so clear that his incitement had led to these riots. And yet the British had appointed the Grand Mufti to his post. He was also the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which the British created. And they could have stripped him of those positions, and they didn't. They allowed him to remain the leader of the Arab people in Palestine. And he became only more powerful. And he began to assassinate his rivals and moderates and peace-seeking people, just as we see Hamas do today. And, that also has had a devastating impact on Palestinian moderates and peace seekers today. They cannot speak out. So we are led to think that all Palestinians are these extremists, which, also only condemns us to more, decades of violence. And the same people who claim to be carrying out these policies in order to bring peace are only furthering it. And in 1930s...
By indeed furthering peace, by funding an education system that unfortunately produces extremists.
Right, I meant, putting peace further into the distance. That's what I meant. And in 1936, when the Grand Mufti led a rebellion against the British, again, they responded in this way, this hope of appeasing Arabs after waves of terrorism. What they did was completely abandon the Balfour Declaration. So this idea that Israel was created with the help of the British, it wasn't. They abandoned the Balfour Declaration, turned their backs on the Jewish people. Amidst the rise of Hitler and against the backdrop of Nazi persecution, immigration from Eastern Europe by Jewish refugees who were fleeing persecution in Europe, they weren't just blocked from arriving in Palestine, in their ancient homeland. They were also sent to British internment camps, tens of thousands of them. And, this just didn't, there were no lessons learned, not by the British, not by the international community. And, I think today we see this same misguided effort to appease and to give terrorists what they want or what they think they want in their Western minds, which they think, they just want some land or they just want negotiations when, they forget that all of those negotiations have led to rejections by Arab leaders. So it's just this absolute failure to learn from the past that really I can't wrap my head around. I don't know how to explain it.
Let's have a look, Yardena, not only about the lessons from history and the similarities, but how those lessons were internalized and processed. I'm wondering how you see the Hebron Massacre as having changed the Zionist movement. And with that in mind, if you could maybe offer some predictions of how October 7th will change Israeli public opinion going forward.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the Zionist movement was not very popular among traditional Jews in Palestine and among Sephardi Jews in Palestine. In 1929, the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later form the nucleus of the IDF, was almost exclusively an Ashkenazi operation in 1929. And after the massacre, waves of Sephardim started to join the Haganah. The Haganah became a much more centralized and much more powerful fighting force because they realized that the British were not going to protect them and that the Jews needed to protect themselves. And Zionism became a unifying force for the Jews of Palestine and a much more powerful force. So we saw how in 1929, the very forces that the Mufti and other Arab leaders were trying to weaken or destroy were actually strengthened by this violence. And in the same vein, we see how after October 7th, the left wing in Israel, which paid the heaviest price on October 7th in southern Israel, so many of those who were kidnapped and killed were peace activists or left-wing Israelis who had spent the previous 9 months protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing government. Even they now say, what hope is there for peace when they really have shown their true colors in simply wanting to destroy us and have openly made that clear since October 7th, with Hamas leaders saying they intend to carry out October 7th over and over again until Israel is gone. So, anyone who thinks, and, I'm speaking about the protesters on college campuses, anyone who thinks that supporting Hamas and Hezbollah is going to lead to Palestinian freedom has really lost their minds and has no idea how these acts of terror and eruptions of horrendous violence really only set back hopes for a Palestinian state and for Palestinian independence. And if they really want to empower Palestinians, it's those moderate and those peace-seeking Palestinians who need to be empowered, because right now, the only ones we hear from are those who have fled either the West Bank or Gaza. I'm thinking of Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib. He's one of the most amazing voices in the Palestinian community, yet he can't say, if he lived in Gaza or the West Bank, he would be long gone by now. Hamas would have. Yeah. So,
and that's your prognosis for that. That's your prognosis for how you think we should remedy the damage that's been done. But I wonder how you think October 7th is going to change Israel and our understanding of what we need to do for our national security. Because the big watershed moment with Hebron, why it rallied support for Zionism, was the realization among Jews that they could only be safe in their own country under the protection of their own army. And October 7th was the moment we realized that even in our own country, under the protection of our army, we're not safe, and that's still not enough. So what do we do with that disturbing realization?
I think we've learned in the hardest way that we cannot afford to not take seriously the threats of our neighbors against us. And I think that's why we've seen everything we've seen since October 7th, this effort to eradicate Hamas and Hezbollah once and for all, this effort to counter the Iranian threat. And I think the lesson has been learned and is continuing to be learned as we speak, is that even without the support of the international community, Israel is going to counter those threats because we can't afford not to. It's not the people of the UK or the people of the US who are being threatened with rockets directed at their cities every day. And I think one of the reasons we see, again, going back to the media's detrimental role in perpetuating this conflict and so much understanding around it, is that we don't see any stories in the New York Times, CNN, NPR about the daily rocket attacks on Israel. So many people are just, of course they're going to think that Israel is the aggressor in this war and that Israel is fighting a war of attrition and a war of vengeance, as if Israel isn't being attacked by these people who are waging war against it every day. And so I think that the only way we will see the international community recognizing who needs support in this war, which is Israel, I think we'll only see that if the media wakes up to its dangerous role in fueling so much death and destruction, especially among the people they claim to want to help.
And that's a very stark analysis, saying that peace is being pushed further away by barbaric Arab violence, by the media ignoring attacks on Israel, by the international community rewarding extremists and fueling more violence, because the lesson that Israelis draw entirely rationally, entirely logically, is that we can only rely on ourselves. And then the international community discovers it doesn't like what that looks like, that Israel thinks that it can only rely on itself. And so I wonder, with the lessons of 1929 in mind, with the lessons of October 7th as you read them, how do you think we build that pathway towards peace to end this century-long conflict in the Holy Land?
Well, I think that the Abraham Accords were an incredible start, and the fact that we saw a coalition of Arab allies assisting Israel in preventing those thousands of ballistic missiles from hurting more Israeli citizens, I think that tells us everything we need to know about where we need to go moving forward, because we do have many more potential allies in the Arab world who also recognize better than the Western world does the threat of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that
Sure, and rallying those alliances from neighboring Arab states and advancing the cause of normalization is critical. But specifically among the Palestinians and this conflict we have with the Palestinians, territorial in nature, religious in nature, I don't think the conditions for peace exist now. I don't think there is a solution that exists. But how do we create a pathway to that conflict with the Palestinians?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I think that is one of the most important lessons from my book, which is that extremists have been allowed to hijack the destiny of millions of Palestinians ever since the inception of this conflict in 1929. And, peace-seeking moderates have been assassinated for speaking out for peace since 1929 and continue to be assassinated for speaking out. And I think that anyone who wishes to see peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and there are many people around the world who do so, imagine if those resources were put into empowering those Palestinians, that they didn't have to fear for their lives to speak out, that they didn't have to flee to the US or to London to speak out for peace, so that they could become the future leaders of their people. Because I agree with you, peace is not possible right now, because look at the people who are leading the Palestinians. I mean, they don't want peace, and they are educating their children to not want peace. But once we see different leaders, once we see peace-seeking moderates able to speak out without fearing for their lives, able to create political parties that can counter Hamas and Fatah and all of these other, factions that reject peace and a future of coexistence. Once those people can come to power, and I have no illusions that this can happen overnight or in a year or two, it's going to take many years, but that empowering of those peace-seeking moderates, coupled with the complete reformation of the Palestinian education system, the end or the replacement of UNRWA with an organization that actually seeks peace and not the destruction of Israel, that is our future. That is the only way forward if we want to see the end to these endless cycles of violence.
Yardena, I devoured your book with great interest, but I do want to push back and wonder whether, in some ways, you might be making the same mistake as victims of the Hebron Massacre in thinking that the way out of the violence is to empower moderate voices. And I say this because the victims of the 29 massacre, they were shocked that it was their neighbors who turned against them. The perpetrators of 1929 were the people they thought were their friends. They were precisely the people they thought would never harm them. they thought they were the moderates. They thought they were the peace seekers. They were the ones they thought they had warm relations with. And I'm quoting your book here. You quote one of the victims saying, "We live in peace among the Arabs." They thought they were already among the moderates, and the moderates were empowered. And then they discovered that the moderates were actually closet jihadists. And I wonder whether the lesson is that when we say we need to empower moderate peace-seeking Arab voices, we need to put on the table that what we mean is we need to empower the voices who accept that the Palestinian national movement has lost in its century-long, forever war against any Jewish state in any borders whatsoever. And empowering the moderates means empowering those who are willing to accept defeat in this century-long war and sue for peace on terms that will enable them to build a constructive national movement instead of fueling or imagining that a Palestinian state will be a stepping stone towards from the river to the sea. And therefore, the challenge is actually much bigger than simply empowering voices who'll speak up for peace. It's empowering voices who are willing to say, we're not refugees. There's no such thing as a right of return. There will no be from the river to the sea. And in order to empower those voices, you need really deep-seated reform of what the Palestinian national ethos is. How do you do that? That seems a lot more dramatic than simply empowering moderate voices and protecting them from assassination. It's changing the way the Palestinians see their society, their culture, and the purpose of their national movement.
I completely agree with you, Eylon. The leadership is what needs to change. But for the leadership to change, because it's the leadership that turned peaceful neighbors into murderers in 1929. It wasn't that these people hated Jews and wanted to slaughter them. It was that their leaders had spent a year convincing them that the Jews among them were really not their friends and really wanted to completely replace the Muslim existence in Palestine with a Jewish temple. And there were all kinds of lies about this plot for domination that were disseminated for a whole year by Arab leaders. So it's the leadership that needs to change. But for us to have different leadership, we need to empower those peace-seeking moderates who want to coexist with the Jewish state, who believe in the idea of a two-state solution and a peaceful Palestine living alongside a Jewish state. And those people do exist. It's just that they cannot speak out and they cannot organize. And I think that if we do want to see different leadership within the Palestinian movement, which of course we do, because it's, we can't fool ourselves. The Palestinian aspirations for statehood are not going away. They're not going to just disappear. But we need leadership that wants a peaceful Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state, and those people exist. So they need to be empowered. But like you said, it's much bigger than that. It's structural, it's societal. It starts with education and the Arabic media not just within the Palestinian territories, but across the Arab world. And that's why I think the Abraham Accords are such a glimmer of hope, because we see that it's possible. I mean, from history that the Egyptian peace treaty, Israel's first peace treaty, before it was signed, peace with Egypt seemed like a absolute fantasy. Israelis were shocked when Anwar Sadat came to Israel. I mean, this had been one of Israel's biggest foes, one of 5 Arab armies that invaded the newly born Jewish state in 1948, one of the Arab countries that invaded Israel in 1967. And I mean, we saw then that peace really is possible with Israel's enemies. But, the groundwork for that peace needs to be built from the ground up. And so that's why I think empowering peace-seeking Palestinians within the West Bank and Gaza, with the help of those who have fled, I think is really one of the most important steps in that process.
I'm not sure how much appetite there really is within the Palestinian movement to essentially acknowledge defeat and end that century-long war against Israel, because, as you say, these voices are silenced. And I think even without the element of Iranian subversion in the region, that really hits the nail on the head, that in order for there to be any peace, in order for Israel to give anything to the Palestinians, Israelis need to be assured that they're not giving them a tool with which to attack us with the goal of ending our country. And right now they're doing a very good job of convincing us, in the spirit of 1929, in the spirit of October 7th, that that is exactly what they seek to do. Yardena Schwartz, author of Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. Where can people buy your book, and where can they follow your work?
So thank you so much for asking. Ghosts of a Holy War is available wherever books are sold. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, at your local bookstore. And you can follow me on Instagram, Yardena S, Yardenas, or on Twitter, X. Also Yardena S, just search my name, Yardena Schwartz. You can see I'm right here. Once again, thank you so much for having me, Eylon. It was such a pleasure speaking with you today.
Yardena, a thought-provoking episode about an even more thought-provoking book. Thank you very much for joining us on State of a Nation.
Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation with Yardena Schwartz, author of Ghosts of a Holy War. If you enjoyed our deep dive into history, you'll also enjoy our episode with Oren Kessler, author of Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict. As always, if you enjoy these episodes, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a glowing review, share it with friends, follow us on all social media platforms, and join us for the next episode. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.